The galaxy, in its infinite wisdom and considerably finite patience, had developed a classification system for planets that could most charitably be described as brutally honest. Class M worlds were pleasant enough: breathable atmosphere, reasonable gravity, the occasional gene paradise beach. Class K worlds required environmental suits, but were otherwise manageable. Then there were Class V worlds, which the Galactic Concordance had officially designated as viable extinction environments, though most species simply called them what they were: death traps wrapped in chlorophyll. Viridian 7 held the distinguished honor of being the worst Class V world in charted space, a jungle planet so aggressively hostile that it had achieved something approaching legendary status among xenobiologists, and, more grimly, among funeral directors across 17 star systems. 11 species had attempted colonization over the past 2 centuries. 11 species had contributed nothing but cautionary tales and extremely detailed autopsy reports to the scientific community. The Zelthani had lasted 3 weeks before the flora digested them. The Kree Vol had managed almost 2 months, which would have been impressive if their final transmissions hadn't been quite so disturbing. The others hadn't warranted much discussion beyond updating the death toll statistics. The Concordance had long since established Protocol Sigma-9 for Viridian 7 when another species inevitably decided to ignore 200 years of corpse-based evidence, simply monitor the situation, document the creative new ways the jungle found to kill them, and prepare the condolence paperwork. The planet's ecosystem operated on a simple principle: everything was either poisonous, carnivorous, parasitic, or some nightmarish combination of all three. The atmosphere was technically breathable, but came with humidity levels that could charitably be called aggressive. The temperature averaged 38 degrees Celsius during the day and never dropped below 25 at night. Previous expeditions had described the experience as living inside a predator's digestive tract, assuming the predator had terrible halitosis and worse intentions. When the human transport vessel designated Perseverance, which should have been the first warning sign, entered orbit around Viridian 7, the Concordance observation station practically groaned with the weight of collective bureaucratic exhaustion. Not again. The station commander, a Vexillian named Kroztek, whose species had evolved specifically to avoid anything resembling physical danger, immediately activated the standard monitoring protocols and began filling out the preliminary death certificates. It was just good time management at this point. The human survey team consisted of 43 individuals who descended to the surface with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for recreational activities rather than elaborate suicide missions. The Concordance observers watched through long-range sensors as the humans established a landing zone in a clearing that had previously served as a feeding ground for something the scientific community had classified as Megafauna Specimen 17, but which really should have been called a mobile nightmare with too many teeth and not enough understanding of personal boundaries. Within the first hour, the humans encountered 6 potentially lethal situations. A vine that secreted paralytic toxins brushed against one team member's arm. A swarm of insects whose larvae exclusively gestated in living neural tissue descended on the group. The ground itself attempted to consume their equipment through an aggressive fungal network that previous expeditions had learned, too late, could dissolve organic matter in under 90 seconds. And Specimen 17, right on schedule, emerged from the tree line with what could only be described as murderous intent and excellent timing. The humans, and this is where Kroztek began questioning his understanding of sentient behavior, started laughing. Not the nervous laughter of species facing their imminent demise, which the commander had documented extensively over his career. This was genuine amusement, as if the universe had just told them a particularly good joke, rather than introducing them to 17 different methods of creative fatality. One human, after narrowly avoiding the paralytic vine, examined it with what appeared to be scientific curiosity, mixed with the kind of respect one might show a worthy opponent. Another calmly sprayed something at the insect swarm that made them disperse. The chemical analysis would later reveal it was a combination of plant extracts that shouldn't have worked but somehow did, because humans apparently approached biochemistry with the same regard for established rules that they showed everything else. As for specimen 17, the humans deployed what they called a deterrent, which turned out to be a handheld device that produced a sound frequency specifically calculated to cause extreme discomfort in creatures with that particular auditory range. Specimen 17 retreated, looking considerably less confident about its lunch prospects. The humans watched it go, then immediately began discussing how to set up a perimeter, as if they planned to stay longer than the 18 hours Crow's Tech had generously estimated for their survival window. The betting pools among the observation station staff started immediately. The Vexillians gave them 2 days. The Morphean delegates, who considered themselves optimistic, suggested perhaps 4 days if the humans were particularly lucky. Nobody bet beyond a week. Nobody except the station's sole Andromedan analyst, who refused to participate on the grounds that she had studied human history and had developed what she called a deeply unsettling intuition about how this would proceed. By the end of the first week, the humans had committed what the Concordance observers could only classify as systematic environmental warfare. They had introduced fire to Viridian 7, which was either brilliantly strategic or catastrophically insane, and the observers genuinely couldn't determine which. Humans, it turned out, had discovered that most of the jungle's aggressive plant life had evolved in an ecosystem where fire was essentially non-existent. The result was that controlled burns created temporary safe zones, while simultaneously clearing sightlines and somehow improving soil quality for the crops the humans were already planning. The Concordant scientific team watched in mounting horror as the humans casually set portions of a planet on fire, then stood around the flames cooking food and discussing their plans with the kind of relaxed demeanor that suggested they were at a social gathering rather than waging an ecological war of attrition. When Croztech sent an emergency inquiry asking if the humans understood the risks of uncontrolled combustion in such a dense environment, the response was a detailed explanation of fire breaks and controlled burning techniques that made the whole operation sound perfectly reasonable, which somehow made it worse. The traps began appearing during the second week, and this was when the Concordance observers began questioning fundamental assumptions about predator-prey relationships. Standard galactic evolution followed predictable patterns. Prey species developed defensive mechanisms, predators developed better hunting strategies, and everyone agreed that the prey species didn't actively hunt the predators unless something had gone terribly wrong with natural selection. Humans apparently had missed that particular memo from the universe. The first trap was discovered by a pack of creatures that the previous Kree-Vol expedition had designated Hellcats, which was both accurate and somehow insufficient. These were ambush predators that hunted in coordinated groups, possessed venomous claws, and had reaction times that made them nearly impossible to avoid. 3 Hellcats fell into a camouflaged pit that the humans had dug in a game trail, complete with sharpened stakes at the bottom. The humans had somehow identified the most used hunting paths, predicted the predator's behavior, and prepared an appropriate welcome. Within days, the jungle around the human settlement had become a carnival of creative death. Snare traps hung from trees, designed to catch anything from mid-sized predators to the flying creatures that had previously enjoyed aerial supremacy. Deadfalls made from logs and counterweights turned established pathways into gambles with poor odds. Trigger mechanisms connected to alarms gave the humans advance warning of approaching threats. The settlement perimeter became less of a boundary and more of a gauntlet that most of Viridian 7's fauna quickly learned to avoid. Kroztek watched a human named Mitchell. They had started using names once it became clear this wasn't going to be a brief observation. Explain the trap system to a colleague. Basically, we're teaching them that this area equals bad news. Predators are smart. They'll find easier meals elsewhere. The casual confidence was disturbing. The fact that it was working was worse. The humans also began eating things, not the carefully selected rations they had brought, though they certainly consumed those as well. No, they started systematically testing the local flora and fauna for edibility, which was either sophisticated xenobiology or elaborate suicide by snack food. They developed methods to neutralize toxins through cooking, fermentation, and processes that involved terms like leaching and careful preparation. Plants that had dissolved xelthany tissue became, after appropriate processing, part of the human diet. They caught specimens of the local aquatic life creatures that previous expeditions had classified as extremely venomous and turned them into what they called pretty decent sashimi once you remove the poison glands. The Concordance botanical expert, a Phyturi who had spent 3 centuries studying xenobotany, submitted a formal complaint after watching humans harvest and consume a plant that secreted a compound known to cause catastrophic organ failure in literally every tested species. The humans had boiled it, drained the water, boiled it again, then added what they called seasoning and ate it with apparent enjoyment. The botanical expert's complaint included phrases like flagrant disregard for biochemical reality and culinary insanity that defies established science, which the station commander filed under human activities, standard because he had created that category in week 2. Temperature readings from the settlement provided another source of bewilderment. While previous species had struggled with the oppressive heat and humidity, often succumbing to heat exhaustion within days, the humans simply adapted. They modified their schedules to avoid the worst midday temperatures, wore clothing that somehow managed to be both protective and heat dissipating, and developed a rotation system that ensured nobody overexerted themselves. One human actually described the climate as like Houston in August, but with better air quality, which meant nothing to the Concordance observers but seemed to satisfy the other humans. By the end of the first month, Viridian 7 had been transformed in ways that contradicted everything the Concordance knew about Class V worlds. Permanent structures stood in the clearing, built from local materials that the humans had processed, treated and rendered suitable for construction. The buildings included not just shelters but a communal space, a medical facility, and something they called a workshop, where they manufactured additional tools and equipment. Solar panels supplemented their power systems. Water filtration units processed the local water sources that had killed 3 previous species through parasitic contamination alone. The domestication incident occurred 6 weeks into the observation period and caused Kroztek to seriously consider early retirement. A human named Rodriguez had somehow befriended one of the smaller predator species, a creature that looked like someone had combined a reptile, a mammal, and a fever dream into something with too many claws and a disturbing number of teeth. Previous expeditions had classified these animals as highly aggressive and unsuitable for any form of contact. Rodriguez called hers Bitey and had trained it to patrol the settlement perimeter in exchange for food scraps and what appeared to be affectionate head scratches. The psychological warfare aspect emerged gradually but proved perhaps most effective. Humans sang while they worked, actual songs with melodies and harmonies that echoed through the jungle. They told jokes during the most dangerous tasks. They maintained what they called morale through social bonding that seemed completely disconnected from their survival situation. A concordant psychologist noted that this behavior served multiple purposes. It maintained group cohesion, demonstrated confidence to potential threats, and possibly convinced the local fauna that these creatures were too insane to be worth attacking. Gardens appeared, which was when the concordance observers stopped trying to make predictions entirely. The humans had analyzed the soil composition, the same soil that had literally digested portions of previous expeditions, made amendments using composted organic matter and materials from their supplies, and successfully cultivated edible plants. They grew vegetables from earth seeds, experimented with local plant species, and discussed harvest schedules with the kind of long-term planning that implied they had completely forgotten they were on a death world. The hope element manifested in countless small ways that accumulated into something larger than the sum of its parts. Humans discussed expansion plans, talked about where they would build additional structures, debated the merits of different crops for future seasons. They created maps of the surrounding territory with notes about resources, dangers, and opportunities. They established protocols and systems designed to last far beyond their individual tenures. One conversation recorded by the monitoring station involved two humans discussing their grandchildren potentially attending university on Viridian 7, which was either inspirational or delusional, and the concordance analyst genuinely couldn't determine which. 6 months after landing, the human settlement had become something that required an entirely new classification. The population had remained stable, no deaths, minimal injuries, and those mostly minor. The infrastructure continued expanding. The humans had established trade agreements with the concordance for supplies they couldn't manufacture locally, offering xenobiological data in exchange. Data that was proving invaluable because humans apparently had an intuitive understanding of hostile ecosystems that other species lacked. When the concordance finally sent a delegation to visit the surface, something they would never have considered for any previous expedition, they found humans who looked comfortable, healthy, and genuinely content with their situation. Mitchell gave them a tour that highlighted the fire management system, the trap network, the gardens, and the recently completed greenhouse. Rodriguez introduced them to Beatty, who had been joined by 2 more domesticated predators that the humans had named Chomps and Professor Teeth. The trick, Mitchell explained with the insufferable confidence of someone who had done the impossible and knew it, is understanding that hostile doesn't mean unconquerable. Every ecosystem has rules. Learn the rules, adapt your approach, and you can thrive anywhere. Earth taught us that. We've got deserts, tundras, jungles, mountains, all of them trying to kill us in different creative ways. This place, it's challenging, sure, but it's nothing humans haven't handled before. The concordance delegation returned to orbit with detailed reports, biological samples, and a growing sense of existential unease about humanity's place in the galactic community. Croztek filed his observations under a new classification system he had created specifically for human activities, inadvisable for any species except humans, who will somehow make it work through spite and questionable judgment. The Galactic Concordance spent 3 months debating how to handle the Viridian 7 situation before finally creating a new planetary classification, Class VH, which stood for Viable Extinction Environment, unless you're human, in which case it's apparently fine. The designation came with extensive documentation about human capabilities, risk tolerance, and the species' disturbing tendency to treat hostile environments as personal challenges rather than appropriate warnings. Death World classifications across concordant space received similar updates. Planets previously marked as unsuitable for colonization gained new designations, noting that humans might, against all reason and established science, decide they were perfectly acceptable locations for settlements. Bureaucrats across the galaxy updated their protocols. If humans wanted to colonize a world that had killed every other species that tried, the appropriate response was apparently to let them monitor the situation for inevitable catastrophe, then watch in confused horror as they succeeded through methods that made no sense, but somehow worked anyway. The Andromedan analyst, who had refused to participate in the original betting pools, submitted a brief report that summarized the situation with uncomfortable accuracy. Humans are what happens when evolution occurs on a planet that is actively trying to kill everything on it, and the dominant species responds by deciding that's just how things are supposed to be. They don't conquer hostile environments through superior technology or overwhelming force. They do it through pattern recognition, stubborn adaptability, and a fundamental unwillingness to accept that something is impossible just because everyone else who tried it died. This isn't military strength or scientific superiority. This is cultural momentum from a species that has spent its entire evolutionary history looking at environments that should have killed them and responding with "hold my beverage, watch this." The galaxy adjusted accordingly, creating new categories, updating risk assessments, and generally trying to incorporate the reality of human capabilities into frameworks designed for species that evolved on planets that weren't actively murderous. Viridian 7 became a case study in xenobiology programs, a cautionary tale for species considering human contact, and a constant reminder that the universe's rules were apparently more like guidelines when humans got involved. And on Viridian 7, humans continued building, planting, trapping, and planning for a future that everyone else had assumed was impossible. They sang while they worked, told jokes in the face of danger, and treated one of the galaxy's most hostile environments like it was just another Tuesday. Because for humans, who had spent millennia turning Earth's countless death zones into homes, that's exactly what it was. The jungle had starved every species before them. The humans built fires, set traps, planted hope, and called it Thursday.